There's something profoundly unsettling about watching confident people realize that the ground beneath their feet, the very foundation of everything they trust, can turn against them without warning. 6 cavers learned this lesson the hard way during what should have been a routine weekend underground. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a 3-day battle for survival, where rising floodwaters, crushing darkness, and raw human terror became their constant companions. They descended as thrill-seekers and emerged as survivors, forever changed by an encounter with forces that cared nothing for human ambition. The planning had consumed months of their lives, the kind of obsessive preparation that only true enthusiasts understand. Blackwater Cave wasn't just another hole in the ground. It was a prize that had eluded cavers for decades. Hidden away on Pete Harding's private land deep in Daniel Boone National Forest, it had been locked away from the public since some forgotten mishap in the 1980s. But Sarah, their leader, had cultivated a relationship with the old man through her graduate work at UK. And after years of persistent charm and scientific credentials, she'd finally worn him down. That morning, they loaded 2 pickup trucks with enough equipment to sustain a small army underground. Pete Harding watched from his porch, nursing coffee and wearing the expression of a man who'd seen too many cocky, young people disappear into the earth with more confidence than sense. His weathered hands and skeptical eyes spoke of hard-earned wisdom about the dangers that lurked beneath his property. The cavers, flush with excitement and adrenaline, probably looked like eager children to him. Children about to learn a lesson that would cost them dearly. The cave entrance looked almost innocent, a modest crack in the limestone hidden behind rhododendron bushes that seemed to thrive in the perpetual dampness. Water stains on the surrounding rock told stories of past floods, but the team's eyes were fixed on the adventure ahead, not the warnings written in stone by decades of Kentucky weather. Each team member brought something essential to the expedition. Lisa Martinez carried the weight of everyone's safety in her EMT training and the comprehensive medical kit that could handle everything from scraped knees to life-threatening trauma. At 23, Tommy was the wild card. Jake's younger brother, athletic and eager, burning with the need to prove he belonged among the experienced cavers. And then there was Mike Sullivan, the writer who'd talked his way into documenting what he was certain would be an epic adventure story. Sometimes the most dangerous person on any expedition is the one who thinks they're just observing. The initial passage felt like a promise of wonders to come. Classic Kentucky limestone shaped by countless years of patient water erosion. Moving single file, their combined lights carved a bubble of reality from the absolute darkness surrounding them. The rock walls bore the smooth signatures of ancient floods, rounded edges and polished surfaces that spoke of water's relentless power over geological time. None of them were thinking about what those smooth walls really meant. An hour of steady progression brought them to the first major chamber, and suddenly the cave revealed why it had captured their imaginations. Their lights swept across a space that could have held a school gymnasium, decorated with flowstone formations that looked like frozen waterfalls suspended in time. Stalactites hung like nature's own chandelier, while the floor bloomed with formations resembling everything from church organs to delicate underwater coral gardens. Sarah, consulting her hand-drawn map with the satisfaction of a treasure hunter, declared this the ballroom, the threshold where their real adventure would begin. Brad immediately lost himself in geological ecstasy, photographing fossil formations and identifying creatures that had lived in ancient seas millions of years before human beings even existed. Lisa documented everything with her camera, while Jake and Tommy explored the side passages that branched off like arteries from the main chamber, their excited voices echoing in the vast space. The deeper they ventured, the more the cave seemed to reward their boldness. They passed through chambers filled with soda straw formations so delicate they looked like they might shatter if you breathed too hard near them. Water had carved galleries that stretched beyond their lights, creating spaces that felt more sacred than any human-built cathedral they'd ever entered. But it was the silence that really got under their skin. In the deepest parts of the cave, quiet wasn't just the absence of sound. It became a living thing, pressing against them from all sides. When they all stopped moving and extinguished their lights, the darkness felt solid enough to touch, and the silence was so complete they could hear their own hearts beating against their ribs, the sound bouncing off limestone walls like a rhythm section, keeping time for their underground symphony. 6 hours into their expedition, they reached what Sarah's map marked as the end of known territory. Beyond this point, they would be walking where no human being had ever walked before, breathing air that had never filled human lungs. It should have been exhilarating. Instead, it marked the beginning of their nightmare. The passage narrowed again, forcing them back onto their bellies to crawl through limestone tubes that had been carved by water over millions of years. But something had changed. The rock felt different beneath their hands. Not the dry, familiar limestone they'd been traveling through, but something damp and treacherous. Water began seeping through ceiling cracks, at first just occasional drops that they wiped away without much thought. But as they pressed forward, the moisture became more insistent, more threatening. Sarah's voice carried the first note of concern when she stopped to examine a wet section of wall. The passage should have been well above the water table, she muttered, more to herself than to the others. Jake tried to reassure everyone that it was probably just groundwater seepage from all the recent rain, but his voice lacked conviction. None of them wanted to acknowledge what they were really seeing, the beginning of something much more dangerous than a simple underground adventure. The passage opened into another chamber, smaller than the ballroom, but impressive in its own right. Limestone formations rose from the floor like frozen flames, and the walls curved away into shadows that their lights couldn't penetrate. But what stopped them cold wasn't the beauty of the space. It was the sound of running water where no water should have been. In the far corner of the chamber, a stream that didn't exist on any of Sarah's maps was flowing steadily across the floor. The water looked innocent enough, clean and clear, but it was moving with purpose, following a channel that led deeper into the cave system like a liquid highway to somewhere they didn't want to go. Sarah's voice was tight, with controlled worry, as she consulted her notes. The surveys from the 80s showed this chamber as bone dry. Brad knelt beside the stream, testing the water temperature with his bare hand, and what he found made his face go pale. The water was cold, really cold, and moving fast for such a small stream. Too fast. That's when Tommy, the kid who was supposed to be learning from the experienced cavers, noticed something that made everyone's blood run cold. The water level was rising. Not slowly, not gradually, but visibly, measurably rising while they watched. They gathered around the spot Tommy had indicated, a small pool where the stream made a bend. What had been a shallow depression just minutes before was now noticeably deeper, and the water kept coming. Sarah's expression transformed instantly from expedition leader to survival expert, her excitement replaced by the focused intensity of someone calculating how long they had to live. She moved quickly around the chamber, checking water levels at different points, observing the direction of flow with the kind of desperate attention that meant everything. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but carried the weight of absolute authority. They needed to move. Now, the next few minutes became a blur of urgent activity and barely controlled panic. They stuffed gear into packs without their usual methodical care, secured equipment with the efficiency of people who suddenly understood that time was no longer their friend. The sound of running water was getting louder, and new streams were appearing in places where the floor had been dry just minutes before. The cave was waking up, and it was hungry. The passage they'd used to reach the chamber was already showing signs of flooding. Water flowed against them as they tried to retreat, and the ceiling seemed to be pressing down lower than it had been on the way in. What had been an uncomfortable crawl was becoming a race against rising water, and the water was winning. Jake's reconnaissance report hit them like a physical blow. The entrance passage was compromised. Water was backing up from somewhere downstream, turning their escape route into a trap. They were cut off from the surface, locked in the Earth's basement with the water level rising around them. Sarah made the decision that would define the next 3 days of their lives. Instead of trying to fight their way back through flooded passages, a battle they would certainly lose, they would push deeper into the cave system, following the natural flow of the water and hoping to find higher ground or another way out. It was a calculated gamble based on her knowledge of Kentucky geology, but it was still a gamble with their lives as the stakes. Most caves in the region were formed by water flow, which meant they generally followed predictable patterns. Water flows downhill, but it also follows the path of least resistance, and that path often leads to other entrances or connections to different cave systems. The problem was that they were now operating in unmapped territory, making life or death decisions based on educated guesses about geological processes that had been millions of years in the making. The new passage led them steadily upward, which offered a thin strand of hope, but it also narrowed dramatically in places. They found themselves crawling through limestone tubes that barely accommodated their bodies, pushing their packs ahead of them through spaces that felt more like stone coffins than pathways to safety. Tommy was beginning to crack under the pressure. The reality of their situation was sinking in. They were trapped underground with rising water behind them and unknown dangers ahead. His breathing became rapid and shallow, the kind of hyperventilation that could turn into full panic in a confined space where panic could be as deadly as drowning. Lisa, despite her own fear, took charge of keeping him calm while the others focused on navigation and survival. Her EMT training kicked in, and she began talking him through breathing exercises, her voice steady and professional even as her own hands shook with exhaustion and terror. She coached him to focus only on the person in front of him, not to think about the tons of rock above their heads or how far they were from sunlight and safety. Just follow Jake's boots and keep breathing normally. Simple instructions for an impossible situation. The passage finally opened into another chamber, this one mercifully free of the flooding that had trapped them below. Their lights revealed a space that might have been beautiful under different circumstances, but all they could see was the possibility of not dying underground. More importantly, they could feel air movement, a subtle current that suggested connection to the surface somewhere ahead. Air movement meant potential exits, and potential exits meant hope. It was the first hope they'd felt in hours. But the cave wasn't finished testing them yet. The passage that led toward the source of the air current presented technical challenges they hadn't expected and weren't properly equipped to handle. What had started as walking passage gradually became a vertical climb through what cavers call a chimney, a crack in a limestone that required specialized techniques to ascend safely. It was the kind of obstacle that would be challenging under normal circumstances, with proper equipment and fresh energy. In their current state, it looked like a death sentence. Jake, with his rescue training and rope work experience, volunteered to take the lead. Using techniques borrowed from rock climbing and cave rescue, he established anchor points and belay systems that would allow the rest of them to follow safely. But this wasn't recreational climbing. This was survival climbing done with inadequate equipment by people who were already exhausted, dehydrated, and operating on pure adrenaline. The climb consumed hours of their rapidly dwindling strength. Each person had to ascend roughly 60 feet of vertical limestone, relying on friction techniques and careful balance to work their way up the chimney. There was no room for error. A fall would mean serious injury in a place where serious injury meant death, and death meant leaving the others to carry the guilt forever. Tommy, despite his inexperience and earlier panic, climbed with the determination of someone who had found strength he didn't know he possessed. His natural athleticism served him well, but it was his mental toughness that really impressed the others. He'd started the day as the kid brother tagging along on an adventure. By the time he reached the top of that chimney, he'd earned his place as a full member of the team, tested by circumstances that would have broken many experienced cavers. When they all finally reached the top, they found themselves in yet another chamber, this one clearly above the flood level. The air was fresher, carrying the faint promise of the surface world they'd begun to think they might never see again. The constant sound of dripping water had been replaced by the subtle whisper of air movement. They were getting closer to the surface, closer to safety, closer to seeing their families again. But they were also getting closer to complete physical and emotional collapse. They'd been underground for over 24 hours, moving almost constantly through physically demanding terrain that pushed their bodies beyond normal limits. Their food supplies were running dangerously low, and their lights were consuming battery power that couldn't be replaced. When the batteries died, they would be trapped in absolute darkness, unable to navigate, unable to continue, unable to survive. Sarah made the difficult decision to rest for a few hours, allowing everyone to recover some strength before the final push toward what they desperately hoped would be an exit. They found a relatively flat area in the chamber and set up a minimal camp, sharing their remaining food and water while trying to conserve every resource they had left. It was during this forced rest that the human element of their situation really hit home. They weren't just cavers anymore. They were survivors, bound together by shared terror and mutual dependence in ways that most people never experience. The usual social dynamics and hierarchies have been stripped away by exhaustion and fear, leaving only the essential bonds of people who needed each other to live through the night. Brad, normally the reserved academic who preferred rocks to people, opened up about his fears for his family, wondering if they'd been notified about the missing expedition, imagining his wife's growing panic as hours turned into days without word. Lisa talked about her work as an EMT and how strange it felt to be the one needing rescue instead of providing it, how helpless she felt without her ambulance and equipment and radio contact with the outside world. Jake and Tommy, despite being brothers, seemed to really see each other clearly for the first time. The older brother's protective instincts were balanced by new respect for Tommy's courage under impossible pressure. They'd started the expedition as siblings with the usual mix of affection and irritation. Now, they were survival partners who trusted each other with their lives. And Sarah, their leader, the one they all depended on for navigation and life or death decisions, admitted her own doubts about the choices she'd made. The weight of responsibility for 5 other lives was something she'd never had to carry, and it was changing her in ways that would last long after they saw sunlight again. Every decision could mean the difference between bringing everyone home safely or leaving families to grieve. That kind of pressure transforms people at the cellular level. When they finally resumed their journey, the passage ahead presented them with the most challenging obstacle yet. The route that promised to lead them toward the surface narrowed to dimensions that challenged even their experienced group. They were looking at a crawlway that would require them to move flat on their bellies, pushing their gear ahead of them through openings barely wider than their shoulders. After everything they'd been through, this final passage seemed designed to test the absolute limits of human endurance and determination. The rock pressed down with crushing weight, and the air grew thin as their labored breathing consumed oxygen faster than the narrow passage could replenish it. Each foot of progress required conscious effort and careful planning. There was no room to turn around, no way to retreat if the passage became impassable ahead. They were committed to forward movement, betting their lives on the hope that the tunnel would eventually open up and lead them to freedom. Lisa, despite her smaller stature, struggled more than anyone with the psychological impact of the confined space. Her EMT training had prepared her for many emergencies, but not for the helpless feeling of being trapped in a limestone tube with no way to escape. The walls seemed to be closing in, the ceiling pressing down, the very air becoming thick and unbreathable. Her whispered confession of defeat, that she couldn't breathe, couldn't continue, that the walls were closing in, could have triggered panic in the others. But instead, it brought out something beautiful in the group. Tommy, the kid who'd started as their least experienced member, had somehow become the heart of their team. He talked her through breathing exercises, reminded her of how far they'd already come, and stayed close enough to provide reassurance without crowding the already impossibly narrow space. The final section of that passage remains the most difficult physical challenge any of them had ever faced. Every inch required conscious effort. Every movement had to be planned and executed with precision. The knowledge that they were committed to forward movement, that retreat was impossible due to the narrowing tunnel, added psychological pressure that pushed them beyond what they thought were their limits. They discovered that the human body and spirit are capable of far more than most people ever realize, but only when survival depends on it. When natural light finally appeared ahead of them, filtering down through cracks in the rock like a gift from heaven itself. They hardly dared to believe it. The secondary entrance was nothing more than a narrow crack in a hillside, hidden by vegetation and probably unknown to anyone except the occasional deer or raccoon that used it for shelter. But to 6 people who had spent 3 days fighting for their lives underground, it looked like the most beautiful sight in the world. Emerging into daylight was like being reborn. They crawled out of that crack in the earth and lay on the hillside, letting the sun warm their faces while they slowly adjusted to the reality of being above ground again. The simple act of standing upright felt like a miracle. The ability to see more than a few feet in any direction seemed like a superpower. The sound of wind in the trees was better than any symphony they'd ever heard. They'd lost equipment, lost weight, lost nearly 3 days of their lives. More importantly, they'd lost the casual confidence that had led them into Blackwater Cave in the first place. They'd seen how quickly adventure could become survival, and how thin the line really was between the world they knew and the darkness that waited beneath their feet. They'd learned that the Earth doesn't care about human plans or human lives, and that survival sometimes comes down to nothing more than the simple human refusal to give up. The rescue teams found them that afternoon, sitting in the sun and still not quite believing they were safe. Their families had been preparing for the worst, and the local authorities had been coordinating search efforts based on the assumption that they were probably dead. The relief on everyone's faces when they realized the missing cavers were alive and relatively unharmed was almost overwhelming to witness. Pete Harding met them at the hospital where they were taken for evaluation. His weathered face showed relief, but also a kind of grim satisfaction. He'd seen the signs that they'd ignored, understood the risks that they'd dismissed as acceptable. His news was both merciful and final. The cave had been sealed. He'd had the entrance filled with concrete the morning after they'd failed to return. Nobody else would go through what they'd gone through. The Earth had claimed its due, and Pete wasn't going to give it another chance to collect. In the months that followed, each of them processed the experience differently. Some returned to caving, but with a profound new respect for the forces they were dealing with. They approached each expedition with the knowledge that the underground world operated by rules that didn't care about human ambition or desires. Others found that the underground world had lost its appeal entirely, that the memory of those 3 days was too vivid, too terrifying to overcome. But all of them were changed by those 3 days beneath the earth. They'd learned something about human resilience and the power of collective determination when faced with impossible odds. They discovered that people are capable of extraordinary things when survival depends on it, and that the bonds forged in life or death situations are unlike any other human connections. They'd also learned that the natural world operates by rules that don't care about human ambition or adventure seeking. The Earth doesn't distinguish between experienced cavers and novices, between the prepared and the unprepared. When geological forces decide to assert themselves, human beings become very small and fragile creatures indeed. Blackwater Cave had tested them in ways they hadn't expected and hadn't prepared for. They'd entered as recreational cavers, seeking adventure and excitement. They emerged as survivors, forever bonded by an experience that few people could understand or appreciate. The cave had shown them what lay beyond the edge of their controlled, predictable world. A realm where geology and physics made all the decisions, and where survival depended on adaptation, courage, and the simple human refusal to surrender to circumstances. Looking back on their ordeal, it becomes clear that they didn't conquer Blackwater Cave. They simply survived it. And sometimes, in a world where natural forces dwarf human ambitions, survival is the greatest victory of all. Their story serves as a reminder that adventure and catastrophe are often separated by nothing more than luck, timing, and the unpredictable moods of the Earth itself.